Cast your eyes around. Clearly, I'm a collector. Happy Gaming House is about spreading that spiritual calling for the physical object and what it represents. But to foster that connection, we need actual games. Game and console didn't start out as discrete entities. Instead, in the beginning, game was console, and console was game. In the early 1970s, the first home system, like the Magnavox Odyssey, came with pre-programmed logic circuits. But already by then, the first commercial microprocessor, Intel's 4004, was making waves. 1976 saw Fairchild debut the Channel F, making use of ROM chips to create the first cartridge-based video gaming device ever. Game collection was born. Atari saw the future and ran with the idea, and the rest is history. Or the video game crash of 1983, which obliterated the market. The very same year, Nintendo would launch the Famicom in Japan. Birthed as the industry was going up in flames, Nintendo got hardline. It would protect itself, and it would do this through cartridges in a very tough legal department. Then experiment with multiple formats and release this. That is still used in the 3D era today. And Sony just released Final Fantasy VII on its PlayStation. So how did it all happen? Today, we ask how Nintendo got so stuck on cartridges through a look at the Famicom Disk System and the ultra-rare N64DD. Nintendo saw the crash as a symptom of a flood of poor quality games. They wanted to tighten things, exerting pressure to get video game rentals banned in Japan in 1984. They developed all Famicom titles themselves for the first year, and thereafter were strict about only accepting licensed game on their platform. Developers had to pay licensing fees for that official Nintendo seal of quality, and by 1985, more or less, all had to source their carts from Nintendo as well, which was able to take a cut on these. Still, piracy flourished. So, the redesigned American version, the NES, which hit the market in 1985, added the 10NES, CIC meaning checking integrated circuit, and a chip in each cartridge used an encrypted code to perform a check with the 10NES gatekeeper, using a proprietary algorithm. The game will only run if the check was passed, an early form of copy protection. These restricted policies were tolerated due to Nintendo's market share clout. The NES restored the video game market and gave us modern third-party development. But despite the profits and power cartridges afforded Nintendo over third-party developers, they were expensive to produce, didn't allow for saving of game data, were vulnerable to supply shortages, and suffered severe memory limitations, as low as 32 kilobytes for early games. Within a few years, Nintendo was looking to the personal computer market for inspiration. Magnetic-based storage like floppy disks appeared to solve many of these issues. The format was widely available. You could write new data onto them and fit more data in general, up to 128 kilobytes for Famicom disks. Nintendo set to work on their own kind of media format based on Mitsumi's Quick Disks, a type of Japanese floppy disk. The result was the Famicom Disk System, this bad boy right here. Released in 1986 and only in Japan. What many outside Japan don't know is just how much Nintendo pushed this format, or just how much of a success it was with 4.4 million cumulative units sold. Once the disk system was on shelves, Nintendo committed to making all its first-party releases exclusive to the format, and the system launched with The Legend of Zelda. In fact, a raft of classics such as the original Metroid, Castlevania, Kid Icarus started out as Famicom disk-only games in Japan, requiring the disk write function to save extra memory for their expansive levels and worlds. All told, the format will see around 200 titles. The disk system added new high-quality FM synthesis, and games retail for far less than cartridge-based ones. What's more, the discs had an A and B sides, allowing for a different game on each side. You could purchase and write new games onto your disc as special kiosks for as little as 1/10 of the cost of a new cartridge. a very attractive option for consumers. You can even fax off high scores to Nintendo with a special machine for special rewards. Support for game writing will continue until 2003, with technical support lasting until 2007. Now, despite these successes, by 1989, the disk system was already practically obsolete, as developers again began to flock to cartridges. But why? Third-party developers were put off by heavy licensing fees and a stipulation that they had to hand over a 50% copyright share for any software developed for the system. Namco and Hudson Soft flat out refused to make Famicom Disk games based on this basis. Being magnetic, the discs were less sturdy, more unprotected, and prone to damage. The disk drive itself suffered from mechanical issues with its fan belt as well. In the meantime, the price of chips was continuing to come down, and cards soon evolved to match or even surpass the memory capacity of the discs. Internal batteries allowed for game saving on cartridges as well. Also, unlike cartridges, discs had the drawback of loading times and needing to be swapped out or turned over. Since Famicom discs were all intents and purposes slightly modified Mitsumi quick discs, which were easy and cheap to write, piracy and unlicensed, often adult-themed games proliferated, much to Nintendo's displeasure. The copy protection worked with the N and the I of the recessed Nintendo mark molded on the bottom of the discs, activating a switch to authenticate the games. It was comically easy for companies to bypass this and avoid infringing on the Nintendo trademark by simply changing out some letters and printing something like Nintendo. As long as the I and N lined up, the unofficial game would work. So within a few years, the disk system had lost its edge and attention shifted back to cartridges. A planned US release of the disk system was scrapped. Nintendo wouldn't abandon the cool idea of overwriting games though. The Nintendo Power Cartridge service allowed consumers to download new SNES and Game Boy games onto special Flash brand cartridges and operated at Japanese Lawson convenience stores until 2001 and directly from Nintendo until 2007. The Chinese IQ player, basically a digital-only N64, would experiment with similar download kiosks. With the Super Nintendo, it was back to quality control and the reliability of cartridges. As a proprietary format, they were harder and more expensive to pirate. Speaking of which, the TurboGrafx-16 became the first CD-ROM console in 1987. And Sega Genesis had their Mega CD add-on. Nintendo was not immune, being first convinced by Sony in 1988 to make their own CD add-on for the SNES. In fact, hundreds of working prototypes of the so-called SNES-CD add-on were produced. However, due to various factors, the partnership had broken down by 1991, at which point Nintendo made a deal with Sony's rival Philips instead. In 2015, a prototype of a Nintendo PlayStation was found. It can play audio CDs and SNES games, though no specific 3D-based games were developed for it, only demos. There will never be an SNES-CD or Nintendo PlayStation. Instead, we got the Philips CD-i, conceived of as a multimedia device, not a video game system as such. It had a trio of awful games like the Zelda game and a Mario game. Hotel Mario, though Nintendo had nothing to do with their development.
Not my business.
Having failed to get off the ground with either of the originators of CD technology, Nintendo was more skeptical of the tech than ever. Not just of the load times or hassle of negotiating partnerships, but over the piracy and open nature of the CD format. They looked back to the video game crash and the Famicom Disk System and doubled down on cartridges. So, N64 stuck with what Nintendo did best. They returned to the Famicom playbook and focused on first-party titles. But the cartridges were hard to develop for. They lacked space. 64 megabyte versus CD's 700 megabyte. Hurt by Nintendo's tight grip and near monopoly in the past, big-name developers like Square and Namco defected to PlayStation. And others like Konami supported the PlayStation much more than they did the N64. Lifetime sales bear this out, with Sony outselling Nintendo at a ratio of 3-1. Nevertheless, it was profitable off the back of the large number of first-party titles and Nintendo's control over the ecosystem and selling cartridges to third-party developers at jacked-up prices. Nintendo will mostly stick with this approach of cartridges going forward to the present day. Nintendo Switch. The love affair with discs hadn't died out either. Enter the N64 disk drive of N64DD. Plans for the N64DD were announced as early as 1995, the year before N64's release. Make no mistake, this was part of Nintendo's original vision of the N64, not an afterthought. In fact, Shigeru Miyamoto was quoted as saying, "Almost every new project for the N64 is based on the 64DD. We'll make the game on a cartridge first, then add the technology we've cultivated to finish it up as a full-out 64DD game." The N64DD used proprietary magneto-optical discs and was attached to the extension port beneath the N64. Much like the Famicom Disk System, the N64DD was designed to get around some of the limitations of cartridges with large rewritable storage and higher data capacity, which is why many of the only 10 games released, yes, 10 titles, that's all. And I'm proud to report we have the complete set right here. Many of the titles focus on creative tools or level design capabilities, which wouldn't have been possible without the extra writable data space. Now, let's dive into some rare Nintendo 64DD games. First up is Mario Artist Paint Studio. I gotta say, this game is a ton of fun. You can create some really cool artwork with a variety of tools available. Plus, the N64 mouse makes drawing super precise. I ended up drawing something I learned in high school geometry class that I thought was really cool. If you loved Mario Paint on the SNES, this is a must try. Now, let's dive into Doshin the Giant. This god simulation game is so unique. You can control this giant deity named Doshin, and it's up to you whether to help or hinder the islanders. I've been having a blast developing their settlements, but the destruction side of it is always more fun. Next, we're checking out SimCity 64, developed by Howard Laboratory. It's a fantastic city building simulation game that's got some sweet enhancements over SimCity 2000. The graphics are top notch, and the new scenarios keep things fresh. It seems like a fun game, but if only I could read Japanese. Besides this, the cassettes could add new features, such as online connectivity with the modem cassette or video capture with the video capture cassette. N64 was no stranger to this modular approach, with the Rumble Pack and Expansion Pack add-ons proving more successful. In the end, the slated 1997 window for the N64DD was missed and was pushed back to 1999, later in N64's lifecycle. Only 15,000 units were sold, making the N64DD a seriously rare piece of hardware. The N64DD makes more sense once we see that the fundamental idea was solid and based on prior successes. It was a new Famicom Disk System fused with a more advanced Satellaview, you know what I mean, but also allowing for multimedia features. Sadly, it came too late and was stuck as a subscription-only product, with many of the promised games never materializing. Initially, it seemed Nintendo were placing N64DD front and center like they had with the Disk System, as a way to take their games to the next level. But big titles like Earthbound 64 and Super Mario RPG 2 never came to fruition. That being said, a dump of an enhanced Super Mario 64DD has found its way onto the internet, as well as Daizamon DD, an expansion of the shoot 'em up creator Daizamon 3D. By the time N64DD rolled around, the Dreamcast was out and the PS2 was right around the corner, so it would never have its time in the sun. Like the add-ons before it, it remained Japan only. Though in 2016, fellow YouTuber Metal Jesus Rocks did uncover an unreleased US version of the N64DD, giving us another taste of what might happen. Now you know how important the format can be when it comes to games. and perhaps why Nintendo has clung so fiercely to cartridges after all these years. A durable and proven format they can design to their own needs and not be at the mercy of others. Nintendo, at its core, does things its own way, for good and for ill. I'm Edison. I'll see you next week.